Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The brownstone on West 35th Street operates on a schedule that would make a Swiss railway envious. And on that particular Tuesday morning in October, everything was running precisely on time. Which is to say, Nero Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids until 11. Fritz was producing something from the kitchen that smelled like a Burgundian dream, and I was at my desk in the office, pretending to organize files while actually reading the sports section. That was when the doorbell rang. I folded the paper, tucked it into the second drawer where Wolfe wouldn't see it, and went to answer it. Through the one-way glass panel, I could see a woman standing on the stoop. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in a charcoal wool coat that had cost somebody real money, with dark hair pinned back with the kind of severe precision that suggests either a military background or a very bad morning. She was not fidgeting. Most people fidget on that stoop. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked directly at the door as though she expected it to open on its own and had decided to wait it out. I opened it. "Archie Goodwin," I said, "because that's what I am." "I know who you are," she said. "I need to see Nero Wolfe. My husband was murdered last night, and the police are approximately useless." She said it the way you'd say the train was late, or the milk has turned. A fact, unpleasant, requiring correction. "Come in," I said. I put her in the front room while I went upstairs. Wolfe's plant rooms occupy the entire top floor of the brownstone. 10,000 orchids in 3 climate-controlled rooms, tended with a devotion that most men reserve for religion or baseball. I knocked, entered, and found him at the potting bench with Theodore Horseman, doing something delicate to a dendrobium that I have never understood and never will. "There's a woman downstairs," I said. "Her name is Sylvia Brandt. Her husband was murdered last night. She's calm, well-dressed, and she's not here to cry on anyone's shoulder. She wants results." Wolfe didn't look up. "I am engaged." "You're playing with flowers." "I am hybridizing. It is a science." The woman's coat cost more than our monthly grocery bill, and Fritz's grocery bills are not modest. She has money, she has composure, and she has a murder that the police can't solve. That's the trifecta, Wolfe. He set down his tool. He looked at the dendrobium. He looked at Theodore. He pressed his lips together in the expression that means he is about to do something he considers beneath him, but has decided to do anyway. 11:15, he said. "All will be in the office at 11:15. I went back down and told Mrs. Brandt she had 12 minutes. She nodded, as though she'd expected exactly that, and settled into the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, with her hands folded in her lap. At 11:14 I heard the elevator. At 11:15, Nero Wolfe entered the office. He is worth describing, even for those who think they know him, because Nero Wolfe is the sort of man who bears re-describing. He weighs approximately 1/7 of a ton. He would tell you exactly 1/7 if pressed, because he is precise about everything, including his own absurdity. He is tall enough that the weight doesn't crush him, and he moves with a deliberate, almost architectural quality, as though each step has been considered in advance. He was wearing his standard office uniform, a yellow shirt that would stop traffic on Fifth Avenue, a dark suit of impeccable cut, and an expression of mild displeasure at being in the same room as someone he had not yet decided to tolerate. He lowered himself into his custom chair behind the desk, a chair that had been engineered by a furniture maker in Queens who charged accordingly, and regarded Sylvia Brandt. "Mrs. Brandt," he said, "you have had a death in your household." "Ah, my husband was murdered," she said. "His name was Richard Brandt. He was found this morning at 6:42 in his private office at Brandt Precision Instruments on 47th Street. He had been shot once, through the chest at close range. The police believe it occurred between 10 and midnight. And you were where during those hours? At home. Alone, unfortunately. Our housekeeper has Mondays off. You have no alibi. No. And the police are aware of this. They are. They've been very polite about it, which I find more alarming than if they'd been rude. She paused. Inspector Kramer came himself this morning. He asked me several questions, and told me very little. I've worked with enough men in positions of authority to know that politeness in that context means they consider me a suspect, and haven't yet decided what to do about it. Wolfe's eyes, which are small and can appear sleepy until you realize they are recording everything within their range with the accuracy of a court stenographer, moved to me briefly and back. You are not weeping, he observed. No. You were not, in your estimation, in love with your husband. She considered that for a moment. We had been married for 19 years. I respected Richard. I relied on him in certain ways. Whether that constitutes love in the romantic sense is a question I've stopped finding interesting. She paused. I did not kill him. I didn't suggest you had. Wolfe folded his hands on his desk. It is a gesture that means he is shifting from assessment to inquiry. Tell me about Brandt Precision Instruments. She did. It took about 15 minutes, and I took notes. Brandt Precision Instruments had been founded by Richard Brandt 30 years ago, built from a small machine shop in the Bronx, into one of the more respected manufacturers of high-precision timing and measurement devices in the Northeast. Their primary clients were aerospace contractors, medical device companies, and more recently, and more lucratively, a government defense subsidiary that required components whose exact nature Mrs. Brandt described only as timing mechanisms. The company had four principal figures beyond Richard Brandt himself. There was Owen Marsh, the operations manager, who had been with the company for 22 years and reportedly considered himself its co-architect. There was Diana LeClaire, the chief engineer, a woman of 38 who had joined 7 years ago and was, by Mrs. Brandt's account, the most technically gifted person in the building. There was Paul Norris, the chief financial officer, who had been brought in 3 years ago and had immediately begun suggesting changes that Richard Brandt had mostly resisted. And there was Carter Webb, a minority shareholder and the company's primary outside legal counsel, who had represented Richard Brandt since the beginning, and whose relationship with the company was, in Mrs. Brandt's careful phrasing, comprehensive. There was also, she added, the matter of the partnership restructuring. Wolfe's eyes sharpened, though only marginally. To anyone who didn't know him, he still looked like a large man sitting comfortably. To me, he looked like a large man who had just heard something he'd been waiting for. Describe it, he said. 3 months ago, she explained, Richard Brandt had begun the process of restructuring the company's ownership and leadership in preparation for what he described as a partial retirement. He intended to sell a significant block of shares to an outside investor, a man named Gerald Frome, who ran an investment fund with a reputation for buying into mid-sized precision manufacturers and extracting value aggressively. Owen Marsh had objected strenuously. Diana LeClaire had submitted a counter-proposal, suggesting the company be taken partially employee-owned. Paul Norris had supported the Frome deal enthusiastically. Carter Webb had drafted 3 versions of the restructuring agreement, and according to Mrs. Brandt, had privately counseled Richard against it. And your husband proceeded anyway? Wolfe asked. The deal was scheduled to be finalized this Friday. She reached into her bag and produced an envelope, which she placed on the desk. That is a check for $10,000 as a retainer. I want you to find who killed my husband before the police decide to charge me with it, and before whoever actually did it benefits from his death. Wolfe looked at the envelope without touching it. Archie, he said. I picked it up and put it in the safe. That means we're taking the case. Mrs. Brandt, Wolfe said, I will require unimpeded access to everyone associated with your husband's company. I will need you to make this possible. I've already drafted a letter to that effect. Wolfe blinked once, which is high praise. One question before you go. You mentioned your husband's office. Was it common for him to be there at that hour? No, she said. Richard almost never worked late. He believed that a man who worked past 7 had failed to organize his day properly. She stood and buttoned her coat with the same decisive calm she'd had on the stoop. He received a phone call yesterday evening at 8:30. I heard him take it in his study. 20 minutes later, he told me he had to go to the office briefly. He didn't say why, and I didn't ask. That was also common with us. You heard nothing of the phone call? Only that his voice changed. Changed how? She thought about it. He became careful, she said. Richard was normally a very direct speaker. After that call, he chose his words. That's all I can tell you. She left. I watched her go down the stoop from the window. Same posture, same deliberate step. As though grief, if she felt it, was something to be addressed in private at a time of her choosing. When I turned back, Wolfe had picked up his book and appeared to be reading. He was not reading. Well, I said. Someone lured him there, Wolfe said, without looking up. The call, the timing, the deviation from habit. Richard Brant was not at his office by accident or industry. He was summoned, which means whoever called knew his number, knew his habits, and knew he'd come. Which means, Wolfe said, someone who knew him very well. He turned a page he hadn't read. Find out everything about that restructuring agreement. And Archie? Yes? What was his business? Precision instruments. Timing mechanisms. He set down the book. A man who built his life around exactness was killed with it. I find that suggestive. I found it suggestive too. I didn't say so. I got my coat and hat and went to find out who had set the clock running on Richard Brant. Brant Precision Instruments occupied the top 2 floors of a building on West 47th Street that had been built in the 30s and not substantially updated since. The lobby smelled of machine oil and old marble. The elevator was operated by a man named Gerald, who told me, unprompted, that Mr. Brant had been a fair boss who always remembered his name. It's the small testimonies that stick. I'd called ahead. Mrs. Brant's letter had done its work, and by 2 in the afternoon I had a temporary badge and a conference room with a window that looked out over a courtyard where pigeons were conducting what appeared to be a vigorous dispute. I saw them one at a time. My standard approach with a group of potential suspects is to watch how they react to being asked to wait. Because people who are asked to wait when they expect to be seen immediately will tell you an enormous amount before they open their mouths. Owen Marsh didn't wait well. He arrived 3 minutes before his scheduled time, and spent those 3 minutes standing in the hallway, because I'd specifically asked the assistant, a composed woman named Mrs. Delgado, who had clearly worked in corporate environments long enough to become largely impervious to drama, to hold everyone in the outer area until I called for them. By the time Marsh walked into the conference room, I had already diagnosed him. He was 61, built like a retired lineman, with thick gray hair and hands that suggested he'd spent the first part of his career actually making things rather than managing people who made things. He had the face of a man who considers himself essential, and has recently received evidence to the contrary. "You're Goodwin," he said, before I said anything. "You work for Wolfe." "That's right. I know about Wolfe. He's the fat man who solves things from his house. He's the brilliant man who finds it more efficient to bring the world to him. Different framing." Marsh sat down without being asked, and put both hands flat on the table. "I didn't kill Richard. I want to be clear about that. Nobody's accused you of anything yet, Mr. Marsh. Relax." I'm not tense. He was extremely tense. "You and Mr. Brant disagreed about the Frome deal," I said. "I disagreed about the Frome deal, yes. Gerald Frome is a man who buys companies to break them into parts and sell the parts. Richard knew this and chose to proceed anyway. I made my objections known through every legitimate channel available to me. That's not motive for murder, Mr. Goodwin. That's corporate governance." "When did you last see Mr. Brant?" "Monday afternoon. We had a meeting about the Q3 production numbers." "Was the meeting contentious?" He paused. "It was frank. About the Frome deal? About several things. Did Mr. Brandt receive any calls during your meeting? Not that I observed. His phone was in his jacket pocket. Did he seem distracted? Worried? Marsh thought about it with the honesty of a man who dislikes giving anything away, but dislikes lying more. He seemed decided, he said finally. Richard, when he'd made up his mind about something, had a particular quality. He stopped debating. He just waited for the rest of the world to catch up. He stopped. He seemed like that yesterday, like he was waiting for something to resolve itself. I thanked him and sent him out. A minute later, Diana LeClaire came in. She was not what I expected, which is my own failing for expecting anything. She was slight, with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of eyes that are always doing math. She wore no jewelry except a watch on her left wrist, an interesting choice in a company that manufactured precision instruments, and not a Brandt product. I made a note of that. Dr. LeClaire, I said. Just LeClaire is fine. She sat down and crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, with a composure that was different from Mrs. Brandt's. Where Mrs. Brandt's was willed, LeClaire's was simply native. I'm told you're investigating on behalf of Sylvia Brandt. That's correct. She's a sensible choice. Sylvia has always been practical. You know her well? Reasonably. We've been at the same table at a sufficient number of dinners to have formed opinions about each other. A slight pause. She didn't do it, if that's what you're building toward. Who did? If I knew that, I'd have called the police instead of waiting for an interview with a private investigator. I asked her about the employee ownership proposal she'd submitted, as an alternative to the Frome deal. She explained it with the clarity of someone who had thought about it carefully, and resented not being heard. But the resentment was intellectual, not personal. She'd wanted the company's technical expertise to remain intact. Frome's model, she said, would almost certainly result in the engineering team being reduced to a skeleton crew within 18 months. Was Brandt going to go through with it regardless? I asked. Yes. He told me so directly, 2 weeks ago. He was not unkind about it. Richard was rarely unkind. He simply had decided, and the decision was not open to further input. How did that make you feel? Professionally disappointed. Personally indifferent. She glanced at her watch. That watch, the one that wasn't a Brandt product. And then back at me. I've had better jobs, and I'll have them again. What I cared about was the work. Where were you last night between 10 and midnight? At home. I live in Brooklyn. I was working on a paper I'm co-authoring for the Journal of Measurement Science. My co-author is in Zurich. We had a video call that ended at 11:15 his time, which is 5:15 mine. After that, I went to sleep. Can your co-author confirm the call? Professor Adler can confirm it, and the call is logged on the platform we use. I'll have Mrs. Delgado send you the details. She said it the way you hand someone a receipt. I moved on. Paul Norris, the CFO, was the third through the door, and he was the most surprising of the group, which is to say he surprised me by being entirely unsurprising. He was 45, slender, with the expensive but generic appearance of someone who'd been styled by a business school and hadn't deviated since. He supported the Frome deal, had supported it from the beginning, and made no effort to pretend otherwise. It was the right decision for the company, he said. Richard's instincts were excellent for the first 20 years of this business, but the market has changed, and the capital that Frome's group brings would have positioned Brandt for the next decade. Would have? He caught it. Yes, would have. Now, I don't know what happens. The shares revert to the estate, presumably. Sylvia will decide. How did that possibility strike you? Which possibility? That with Richard Brandt gone, Sylvia Brandt now controls the disposition of those shares. He looked at me with the expression of a man deciding whether to be offended. I didn't kill Richard Brandt to accelerate a deal that he was going to finalize in 4 days anyway. What if something had changed? What if the deal was in danger of falling apart? It wasn't. How do you know? He paused for exactly the length of time that indicates a man is choosing between what he knows and what he wants to say. I spoke with Frome's representative last week. Everything was on track. Last week, I said. What about this week? He said nothing. I let it sit there for a moment, the way Wolfe has taught me. Not filling silence, letting it do its work. There may have been, Norris said carefully, a complication. Tell me about the complication. I'd prefer to discuss that with Mr. Wolfe directly. That told me quite a lot. People who want to discuss things with Wolfe directly are people who think they can manage the conversation better face-to-face with the organ grinder than with the monkey. I told him I'd arrange it, and sent him out. Carter Webb was the last one in, and he was the most interesting, which is often the way with lawyers. After that call, he chose his words. That's all I can tell you. She left. I watched her go down the stoop from the window. Same posture, same deliberate step, as though grief, if she felt it, was something to be addressed in private at a time of her choosing. When I turned back, Wolfe had picked up his book and appeared to be reading. He was not reading. Well, I said. Someone lured him there, Wolfe said, without looking up. The call, the timing, the deviation from habit. Richard Brant was not at his office by accident or industry. He was summoned, which means whoever called knew his number, knew his habits, and knew he'd come. Which means, Wolfe said, someone who knew him very well. He turned a page he hadn't read. Find out everything about that restructuring agreement. And Archie? Yes? What was his business? Precision instruments. Timing mechanisms. He set down the book. A man who built his life around exactness was killed with it. I find that suggestive. I found it suggestive too. I didn't say so. I got my coat and hat and went to find out who had set the clock running on Richard Brant. Brant Precision Instruments occupied the top 2 floors of a building on West 47th Street that had been built in the 30s and not substantially updated since. The lobby smelled of machine oil and old marble. The elevator was operated by a man named Gerald, who told me, unprompted, that Mr. Brant had been a fair boss who always remembered his name. It's the small testimonies that stick. I'd called ahead. Mrs. Brant's letter had done its work, and by 2 in the afternoon I had a temporary badge and a conference room with a window that looked out over a courtyard where pigeons were conducting what appeared to be a vigorous dispute. I saw them one at a time. My standard approach with a group of potential suspects is to watch how they react to being asked to wait. Because people who are asked to wait when they expect to be seen immediately will tell you an enormous amount before they open their mouths. Owen Marsh didn't wait well. He arrived 3 minutes before his scheduled time, and spent those 3 minutes standing in the hallway, because I'd specifically asked the assistant, a composed woman named Mrs. Delgado, who had clearly worked in corporate environments long enough to become largely impervious to drama, to hold everyone in the outer area until I called for them. By the time Marsh walked into the conference room, I had already diagnosed him. He was 61, built like a retired lineman, with thick gray hair and hands that suggested he'd spent the first part of his career actually making things rather than managing people who made things. He had the face of a man who considers himself essential, and has recently received evidence to the contrary. "You're Goodwin," he said, before I said anything. "You work for Wolfe." "That's right. I know about Wolfe. He's the fat man who solves things from his house. He's the brilliant man who finds it more efficient to bring the world to him. Different framing." Marsh sat down without being asked, and put both hands flat on the table. "I didn't kill Richard. I want to be clear about that. Nobody's accused you of anything yet, Mr. Marsh. Relax." I'm not tense. He was extremely tense. "You and Mr. Brant disagreed about the Frome deal," I said. "I disagreed about the Frome deal, yes. Gerald Frome is a man who buys companies to break them into parts and sell the parts. Richard knew this and chose to proceed anyway. I made my objections known through every legitimate channel available to me. That's not motive for murder, Mr. Goodwin. That's corporate governance." "When did you last see Mr. Brant?" "Monday afternoon. We had a meeting about the Q3 production numbers." "Was the meeting contentious?" He paused. "It was frank. About the Frome deal? About several things. Did Mr. Brandt receive any calls during your meeting? Not that I observed. His phone was in his jacket pocket. Did he seem distracted? Worried? Marsh thought about it with the honesty of a man who dislikes giving anything away, but dislikes lying more. He seemed decided, he said finally. Richard, when he'd made up his mind about something, had a particular quality. He stopped debating. He just waited for the rest of the world to catch up. He stopped. He seemed like that yesterday, like he was waiting for something to resolve itself. I thanked him and sent him out. A minute later, Diana LeClaire came in. She was not what I expected, which is my own failing for expecting anything. She was slight, with close-cropped natural hair, and the kind of eyes that are always doing math. She wore no jewelry except a watch on her left wrist, an interesting choice in a company that manufactured precision instruments, and not a Brandt product. I made a note of that. Dr. LeClaire, I said. Just LeClaire is fine. She sat down and crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, with a composure that was different from Mrs. Brandt's. Where Mrs. Brandt's was willed, LeClaire's was simply native. I'm told you're investigating on behalf of Sylvia Brandt. That's correct. She's a sensible choice. Sylvia has always been practical. You know her well? Reasonably. We've been at the same table at a sufficient number of dinners to have formed opinions about each other. A slight pause. She didn't do it, if that's what you're building toward. Who did? If I knew that, I'd have called the police instead of waiting for an interview with a private investigator. I asked her about the employee ownership proposal she'd submitted, as an alternative to the Frome deal. She explained it with the clarity of someone who had thought about it carefully, and resented not being heard. But the resentment was intellectual, not personal. She'd wanted the company's technical expertise to remain intact. Frome's model, she said, would almost certainly result in the engineering team being reduced to a skeleton crew within 18 months. Was Brandt going to go through with it regardless? I asked. Yes. He told me so directly, 2 weeks ago. He was not unkind about it. Richard was rarely unkind. He simply had decided, and the decision was not open to further input. How did that make you feel? Professionally disappointed. Personally indifferent. She glanced at her watch. That watch, the one that wasn't a Brandt product. And then back at me. I've had better jobs, and I'll have them again. What I cared about was the work. Where were you last night between 10 and midnight? At home. I live in Brooklyn. I was working on a paper I'm co-authoring for the Journal of Measurement Science. My co-author is in Zurich. We had a video call that ended at 11:15 his time, which is 5:15 mine. After that, I went to sleep. Can your co-author confirm the call? Professor Adler can confirm it, and the call is logged on the platform we use. I'll have Mrs. Delgado send you the details. She said it the way you hand someone a receipt. I moved on. Paul Norris, the CFO, was the third through the door, and he was the most surprising of the group, which is to say he surprised me by being entirely unsurprising. He was 45, slender, with the expensive but generic appearance of someone who'd been styled by a business school and hadn't deviated since. He supported the Frome deal, had supported it from the beginning, and made no effort to pretend otherwise. It was the right decision for the company, he said. Richard's instincts were excellent for the first 20 years of this business, but the market has changed, and the capital that Frome's group brings would have positioned Brandt for the next decade. Would have? He caught it. Yes, would have. Now, I don't know what happens. The shares revert to the estate, presumably. Sylvia will decide. How did that possibility strike you? Which possibility? That with Richard Brandt gone, Sylvia Brandt now controls the disposition of those shares. He looked at me with the expression of a man deciding whether to be offended. I didn't kill Richard Brandt to accelerate a deal that he was going to finalize in 4 days anyway. What if something had changed? What if the deal was in danger of falling apart? It wasn't. How do you know? He paused for exactly the length of time that indicates a man is choosing between what he knows and what he wants to say. I spoke with Frome's representative last week, Everything was on track. "Last week," I said. "What about this week?" He said nothing. I let it sit there for a moment, the way Wolfe has taught me. Not filling silence, letting it do its work. "There may have been," Norris said carefully, "a complication." "Tell me about the complication." "I'd prefer to discuss that with Mr. Wolfe directly." That told me quite a lot. People who want to discuss things with Wolfe directly are people who think they can manage the conversation better face-to-face with the organ grinder than with the monkey. I told him I'd arrange it, and sent him out. Carter Webb was the last one in, and he was the most interesting, which is often the way with lawyers. I looked around the office for what might have been retrieved. The credenza drawers were mostly empty of anything sensitive. Standard stationery, old correspondence. The desk drawers had been examined by the police, but a locked drawer on the lower right had been found open, its lock apparently engaged and then released, which the police noted but hadn't explained. That drawer was empty when found. He'd come to get something from a locked drawer. He'd gotten it. And then someone had come in through the internal door, the one with the scuff mark, and shot him. Or he'd come to meet someone. The drawer was already empty, and the item in question was what the meeting was about. Or the item in the drawer was why he'd been called. Someone wanted it, and either killed him before he could produce it, or killed him after, to prevent him from taking it back. I walked to the window and looked out at the midtown sky, which was doing nothing helpful. The impressions on the blotter were going to be crucial. Whatever he'd written on that legal pad in the hours before his death was as close to a dying statement as we were likely to get from a man who'd spent his life being precise. I was back at the brownstone by noon, and Fritz had produced a lunch of cold poached chicken with a walnut sauce that deserved a more contemplative audience than I was currently able to provide. Wolfe was at the table with a book propped beside his plate. He disapproves of reading at meals, but makes an exception when the reading is of sufficient quality, or when he is thinking hard enough that the book is simply a prop to prevent conversation. I gave him my full report. Owen Marsh's tension, Leclerc's composed intelligence, Norris's interrupted sentence about the deal's complication, Webb's pre-prepared memo, and Mrs. Delgado's voicemail revelation. I gave him the room. The second door, the scuff mark, the empty locked drawer, the blotter impressions. He listened without interruption, which is the best audience I ever have. When I finished, he picked up a forkful of chicken and ate it and set his fork down. "The drawer," he said. "Yes." He came to retrieve something from a locked drawer in his own office. Not to review files, not to work late, to retrieve a specific item that required that he go personally, in the evening, in response to a phone call. Which means whoever called him knew what was in that drawer, or told him something that made him believe he needed to go there. He was quiet for a moment. What is kept in a locked desk drawer that a man of affairs considers sensitive enough to warrant a personal after-hours visit? Documents, I said. Financial records, contracts, something he didn't want digitized or emailed. Or something given to him in person and kept there precisely because it was physical and private and not part of any electronic system. He reached for his glass. Norris said there was a complication. He did, and then stopped himself. Yes, that hesitation is suggestive. A financial complication, at that stage of a transaction, could be significant enough to unravel it entirely. He looked at the ceiling, which is where he looks when he's building. Someone called Brant. That call produced in him, by Mrs. Brant's observation, a quality of carefulness, of choosing his words, not fear, deliberateness, like a man who's just been handed a problem, or a man who has just understood one. He returned to his chicken. "Tomorrow, Archie, I want them all here." "All four of them, plus Mrs. Brant?" "All four. Mrs. Brant need not attend. She has told me what she knows, which is less than she thinks and more than she realizes." He ate. "And get those blotter impressions analyzed. Today." I got the name of a document examiner from our files, and took the photographs over that afternoon. By evening, I had a preliminary report on the impressions. Partial numbers, what appeared to be initials, and 4 words that had been written and underlined with enough force to leave a deep impression through 2 sheets. The words were, "Not what he said." That's the thing about precise men. When something doesn't add up, they write it down. Nero Wolfe dislikes having strangers in his office. He dislikes it in the way that some people dislike cold weather or loud music. Not with any dramatic passion, but with a settled, constitutional objection that expresses itself as punctuality, rigid formality, and a willingness to make the experience as uncomfortable as possible for everyone involved, except himself. He was behind his desk at 10 the following morning when they arrived. I had arranged the chairs, 4 of them, in a slight arc across from the desk, and stood by the bookcase with my notebook, which is my standard position during what I think of as the Wolfe sessions. It gives me a clear sightline to all of them, and keeps me out of the main field of engagement. Wolfe prefers me peripheral. He says it's because my commentary during interrogations disrupts his concentration. I think it's because he doesn't want anyone watching his face when he's watching theirs. They came in more or less together, which was by design. I'd told each of them 10 o'clock, and had made the invitation sound collective enough that they'd had the uncomfortable experience of meeting in the lobby and riding up in a group. Nothing loosens a collection of people who are carefully managing their presentations, like forcing them to navigate each other before the main event. Owen Marsh sat on the far left, with the posture of a man who has decided to be unimpressed by the surroundings and is losing the fight. The office has that effect. The books, the desk, the uncompromising yellow of Wolfe's shirt, the smell of the late morning coffee Fritz had set out on the side table. It is not a room designed to put people at ease. Diana LeClaire sat next to him and looked around once, methodically, the way she would assess a new piece of equipment, and then directed her attention to Wolfe with a quality of settled patience. Paul Norris sat in the middle, and I noticed he'd chosen it. He'd let Marsh and LeClaire take their seats and positioned himself between them and Webb, equidistant from both groups. That's the move of a man who's been in boardrooms where sides were being chosen. Carter Webb sat on the far right, with his legs crossed and his hands folded, and if the situation struck him as unusual, he had found a way to accommodate it. Wolfe looked at them for a moment without speaking. He does this. It is not a power play exactly. It is a genuine assessment, a final calibration before he begins. After a suitable pause, he said, "I am Nero Wolfe. You know why you are here. I will not belabor the preliminaries. Richard Brant was murdered. One of you killed him. I intend to establish which one." The room had a particular quality of silence after that. Marsh broke it. "That's a hell of an opening." "It is accurate," Wolfe said. "Would you prefer a preamble?" "I'd prefer not to be accused of murder in a stranger's living room. This is my office, and I have not accused you specifically. I'd have stated a conclusion that evidence supports, that the murderer is someone who knew Mr. Brant well enough to summon him by phone, knew the building well enough to enter and exit through the service corridor, and had access to both a firearm and the information necessary to identify which of the building's access systems could be circumvented." Wolfe settled back. That described someone with an intimate professional relationship to both the man and the institution. Webb cleared his throat. "The police have reached the same general conclusion, I believe. The police are working through conventional channels. I am not." Wolfe looked at Norris. "Mr. Norris, you indicated to my associate that there was a complication with the Frome transaction. You declined to specify. I would like you to specify now." Norris shifted slightly. "I'm not sure that's relevant." "Allow me to be the judge of relevance." A pause. Around him, the other 3 remain still, though with the particular quality of stillness that means they are listening very carefully. "3 days before he died," Norris said, "I learned that Gerald Frome had withdrawn from the transaction. The room changed. Marsh, to his credit, said nothing. Leclerc's expression didn't shift, but something in her attention sharpened. Webb uncrossed his legs. "Withdrawn," Wolfe said. "On what basis?" "I don't know the full details." His office communicated through an intermediary, a brief letter to Richard, copy to me. The transaction was being terminated, effective immediately, citing unspecified concerns that had come to Frome's attention regarding the company's regulatory standing. "Regulatory standing," Wolfe repeated. "That is a particular phrase. Describe its implications." "A company in the precision instruments sector, particularly one with defense contracts, is subject to significant regulatory oversight. If questions arose about compliance with export controls, classification requirements, manufacturing standards, the kind of questions that Frome's due diligence might surface," he stopped, "it could make a company unmarketable overnight." "And who in this room," Wolfe said, with the gentleness of a trap closing, "would have had access to the kind of internal information that could produce such questions?" No one answered immediately. Then Leclerc said, "All of us." "Quite," said Wolfe. "But more specifically, who would have had both the motivation to torpedo the transaction and the technical knowledge to identify a regulatory concern that would be credible to Frome's advisors?" Marsh said, flatly, "If you're pointing at me—" "I am pointing at the shape of the situation," Wolfe said. "Mr. Marsh, you oppose the Frome deal strenuously. If the deal were killed through a manufactured regulatory concern, you would benefit professionally from its collapse. But you would also require technical specificity to make such a concern credible. That specificity exists primarily in the engineering division." Leclerc said, "I oppose the deal through legitimate channels." "You did. And your proposal for employee ownership would have been more advantageous to you, personally, than the current arrangement, yes? More advantageous to the employees generally, and specifically to you as the senior technical officer who would have received a significant equity position under your proposal." She didn't deny it. "Yes." Wolfe looked at Webb. "Mr. Webb, the letter terminating the Frome transaction, do you know who received it first?" Webb said carefully, "I was copied." "Before or after Mr. Norris?" "I received it." He stopped. "The timestamp would indicate I received it at 11:14, and Richard received his copy at 11:22. "You were copied before the principal. Why?" "It was addressed to Richard, care of my office. That's not unusual for formal correspondence in ongoing transactions. His letters were often routed. But in this case," Wolfe said, "you had approximately 8 minutes of prior knowledge that the deal had collapsed before your client was informed. What did you do during those 8 minutes?" Webb's composure was admirable. "I reviewed the letter." "Did you call anyone?" "I may have placed a call to confirm the letter's authenticity." "To whom?" The pause was longer this time. "To a contact at Frome's office." "And what did your contact tell you?" "That the withdrawal was genuine, that the concern prompting it related to an anonymous communication Frome's compliance team had received, suggesting that one of the company's defense contracts involved timing components that may not have met export classification requirements." Wolfe was still. The room was still. "An anonymous communication," he said, "sent to Frome's compliance team, which triggered a withdrawal from a transaction worth, by my estimation, several $1,000,000, which was then communicated in a letter routed through the office of the company's counsel before the company's owner received it." He folded his hands. "Mr. Webb, did you send that anonymous communication?" The silence that followed was long enough to be conclusive in itself. "No," Webb said. "Do you know who did?" "I have a suspicion." "Share it." "Not without more certainty." Wolfe regarded him for a long moment. "Very well," he said at last. "We will return to this. Mr. Marsh, on the evening of Mr. Brandt's death, you told my associate you last saw him at 4 in the afternoon. Is there any other contact you had with him that day?" "No." "No phone call?" "No." Wolfe looked at him steadily. Marsh held it. Then Wolfe said, "Mr. Norris, when did you receive the Frome withdrawal letter?" "That morning, Monday morning." "And did you inform Mr. Brant?" "He received his copy." "I asked whether you informed him, directly by conversation." Another pause. "I spoke with him briefly that afternoon." "About the withdrawal?" "About?" Norris exhaled. "About the implications." "And what were the implications as you presented them?" "That the deal wasn't necessarily dead. That Frome's withdrawal could be a negotiating position. That if the underlying regulatory concern could be addressed, there might be a path to reviving the transaction." "Did you believe that?" Norris looked at the bookcase behind Wolfe, then back. "At the time, yes." "And do you believe it now?" He didn't answer. Wolfe let it sit. Then he turned to all four of them, with the expression he gets when he is wrapping up a portion of the work. Not concluding, but marking a transition. "You may go," he said. "I may need you again. Do not leave the city." They filed out with the particular energy of people who have been through something and are still deciding what it was. I showed them to the door, and came back to find Wolfe with his eyes closed, which means he's working at full capacity. "The lawyer knows something," I said. "Obviously." And Norris told Brant the deal could be revived, which means whatever Brant went to his office to retrieve that night, he may have been trying to resolve the regulatory question himself, trying to save the deal. Wolfe opened his eyes. Or to prove it had been sabotaged. The anonymous communication, sent to Frome's compliance office by someone who knew exactly what it would contain. Someone with technical knowledge of the defense contracts and access to the company's internal documentation. He sat forward. "Archie, the item in that locked drawer, I believe I know what it was." "Tell me." "Not yet. First, go back to that building and find out who has had access to the service entrance keycard system in the past 30 days. I want a log. And if they won't give it to me—" He looked at me with the faint expression that means the question is beneath us both. I went and got the log. The keycard access log for the service entrance of the 47th Street building was maintained by the building's management company, a firm called Meridian Property Services that operated out of an office on 6th Avenue, which smelled of carpet cleaner and managed disappointment. The man in charge of the access logs was named Hendricks, who had the beleaguered efficiency of someone who has been asked for things he's not supposed to provide, often enough to have developed a system for it. I explained that I was investigating on behalf of the Brant estate, produced Mrs. Brant's letter, and added as a supplement an expression of such earnest goodwill that Hendricks eventually printed me a 30-day log of the service entrance, while maintaining the fiction that he was doing me an unofficial favor rather than anything that might concern his supervisors. I took the log to a coffee shop on the corner and went through it with a highlighter. The service entrance had been accessed in the 30 days prior to the murder by 14 distinct keycard holders. Most of these were building maintenance staff, identifiable by the frequency and timing of their entries, consistent with regular work schedules. The building's cleaning service came through 3 times a week. A vendor for the ground floor tenant accessed it twice. Brant Precision Instruments had 4 registered keycards for the service entrance. 1 assigned to Owen Marsh, 1 to Diana LeClaire, 1 to a general facilities code managed by Mrs. Delgado, and 1 to Richard Brant himself. I noted the dates and times of each relevant entry. Owen Marsh had used his keycard 3 times in the past 30 days, all during regular business hours, between 8 and 6. Nothing after hours. Diana LeClaire had used hers twice, once on a Saturday morning, which the note in the margin of her personnel file I'd obtained would have explained as her habit of working weekend mornings, and once on the Monday of the murder, at 9:43 p.m. I sat with that for a while. Diana LeClaire had entered the building through the service entrance at 9:43 p.m. on the night Richard Brant was killed. Richard Brant had entered through the front at 9:17. He'd been found dead the following morning. I called Wolfe and told him. Interesting, he said. Interesting. You want to tell her to come back in? Not yet. Find out where she says she was. She told me she was on a video call with Professor Adler in Zurich until 5:15 a.m. Zurich time, which is 11:15 p.m. New York time. And the keycard entry was at 9:43. Right. So she could have entered at 9:43, done whatever she did, and been back in Brooklyn in time to be on that call at her end. Zurich is 6 hours ahead. The call would have started at 5:15 a.m. Zurich, which is 11:15 p.m. New York. Leaving her, Wolfe said, approximately an hour and a half between her building entry and the time she would have needed to be available for that call. An hour and a half, I said, is enough time. It is, but do not arrest conclusions prematurely. Find out what she was doing there. She might not tell me. She might not tell you, he agreed. Ask her anyway. I went to Brooklyn. Diana LeClaire lived in a brownstone in Carroll Hill, not unlike the West 35th Street address, except smaller, quieter, and in a neighborhood that still had a hardware store. She answered the door in jeans and a sweater, and showed no particular surprise at seeing me. I expected someone would come, she said. Did you expect it would be today? Roughly. The apartment was what you'd expect, from someone whose primary relationship is with precision. Organized without being sterile. Books on shelves in a system that wasn't alphabetical, but wasn't arbitrary either. A drafting table near the window, covered with what looked like component schematics. She made coffee. Good coffee, with the automated confidence of someone who has optimized the process. And we sat at the kitchen table. You were at the building Monday night, I said. Yes. At 9:43. I didn't know the exact time, but yes. Why? She wrapped both hands around her mug. I knew about the Frome withdrawal. Norris had told me Monday afternoon. He told all of us, in what I think he imagined was a private conversation with each of us, but Owen and I compared notes. She paused. I knew that Richard was going to try to salvage the deal. That was Richard. He didn't abandon things. He would go back and find the seam and work it. So you went to the building. I went to talk to him. I tried calling and he hadn't answered. He sometimes turned his phone off when he was working through something. She looked at her coffee. I wanted to tell him that I thought the anonymous communication to Frome had been manufactured, that the regulatory concern it raised was based on a mischaracterization of our classification procedures. Technically accurate in isolation, deeply misleading in context. In other words, you knew what the communication had said. I know the material it would have had to contain to be credible. Whoever wrote it knew our compliance documentation well enough to quote from it accurately. The quotations were real. The conclusions were false. She said it with the clarity of someone who has been rehearsing this part. I wanted to tell Richard that in person, because I didn't trust any electronic channel, and because it was the kind of thing that needed to be said face to face. What happened when you got there? She was quiet for a moment. I went in through the service entrance. I usually do when I come in late. It's closer to the elevator. I went up to Richard's floor. She stopped. The fire door at the top of the service stairwell was ajar. That's unusual. It has a self-closing mechanism. And I heard voices. Raised voices, from inside the corridor, near Richard's office. You heard them through the door? The door was ajar, she said. A few inches. I didn't open it further. Whose voices? Richard's, she said, and one other. Man or woman, I didn't recognize the voice. I want to be clear about that. I genuinely don't know whose it was. It was low, and they were both speaking at the same time at several points, and I didn't hear every word. What did you hear? She set down her coffee. Richard said, you had no right, and the other voice said something I didn't catch. And Richard said, that document was mine. And then a long silence, and then a sound I thought was the door to Richard's office closing hard. I watched her. She wasn't performing. She was reporting. And then I left. I didn't I told myself it was a private confrontation, and I wasn't meant to hear it. I told myself I'd talk to Richard in the morning. Her voice was steady, but not without effort. I know how that sounds now. Did you see anyone in the corridor? No. The door was ajar no more than a few inches. I saw light under it. I left. She picked up her coffee and put it down again without drinking. If I'd opened that door? You didn't, I said. Can you tell me anything at all about the voice, accent, age, speech pattern? She thought about it honestly. Older, deliberate, not. It was not an angry voice, which is the strange part. He wasn't shouting. He was explaining something. The way someone explains something when they know they're right and are tired of waiting for the other person to accept it. I thought about that on the train back to Manhattan. That document was mine, Richard Brandt, about something in a locked drawer that was now missing. Something he'd been called to retrieve, or called to confront, and someone had gotten there before him, or had come to face him about it. The voice that was older, deliberate, not angry, but explaining, with the weariness of a man who considers himself right. I've been in enough rooms with enough people to know that certainty without anger, in a confrontation, is often more dangerous than fury. There is a particular state that Nero Wolfe enters when he is in the final assembly stage of a case, which I think of as his cathedral mode. He becomes very still. He reads without reading. He eats with more than usual attention. He does not speak unnecessarily, and he does not sleep. Or if he does, it is the active sleep of a mind that has not shut down, but merely dimmed its visible output. He was in this state for most of Thursday. I gave him everything I had, the keycard log, the Leclerc interview, the analysis of the blotter impressions, and the additional piece of information I'd pried out of Hendricks at Meridian Property Services on my second visit, which was that the service entrance keycard assigned to Owen Marsh had been, according to the log, deactivated and reissued 3 weeks ago after Marsh reported it missing. 3 weeks ago. 1 week before the Frome withdrawal letter arrived. I also got, through a contact at the police department, whose goodwill I maintained through a combination of baseball tickets and remembered birthdays, access to the security camera footage from the lobby of the 47th Street building. The service entrance camera had been offline the night of the murder, a malfunction, logged 2 weeks prior, not yet repaired. Convenient, I told Wolfe. Planned, he corrected. Planned requires knowing the camera was down, or ensuring it. Who would have the access to interfere with a building security camera? Someone with a relationship to the building's management, or someone with sufficient technical competence to recognize the vulnerability and exploit it without appearing to interfere at all. He was in his chair with a beer, which he drinks in the afternoon when the thinking is at full production. The camera malfunction was reported 2 weeks before the murder. The key card was lost and replaced 3 weeks before. These are preparations, Archie. Someone was building toward this for at least 3 weeks. That rules out an impulse killing. It rules out everything except deliberate, premeditated murder by someone with detailed knowledge of the building's systems, the victim's schedule, and the specific vulnerability in the company's regulatory position. He drank. The anonymous communication to Frome's compliance office was not an act of sabotage for its own sake. It was the mechanism by which the killer forced Brandt to act. I worked through it. They sent the communication. Frome withdrew. Brandt was told, by Norris, that the deal might be salvageable. Brandt decided he needed to address the regulatory question. The killer knew Brandt well enough to know how he'd respond. He would go back to the source, Wolfe said. He would find whatever documentation established his company's compliance, whatever physical record he kept in that drawer, which was separate from the electronic systems precisely because he didn't trust electronic records for the most sensitive materials. And the killer called him Monday evening to, what? To make sure he went? To ensure the timing, Wolfe said. If Brandt went on his own initiative, he might have gone at any hour, or brought someone with him, Mrs. Brandt, Leclerc, Marsh. The phone call controlled the moment. It gave the killer a precise window. I thought about the phrase on the blotter. Not what he said. Brandt arrived, I said, and went to his drawer. Maybe the document was still there. He retrieved it. But before he could do anything with it, or maybe after he'd looked at it, he wrote those words on his legal pad. Something didn't match. Something in the document contradicted what someone had told him. Or what someone had told Frome, Wolfe said. The anonymous communication claimed a specific regulatory violation. Brandt retrieved the original documentation and found the claim was false, or rather, found the way in which it was technically constructed, from real materials, to produce a false impression. He wrote it down, because he was a precise man, and he wrote things down. And then the killer came in. Wolfe set down his beer. The document is gone. The killer took it, presumably to prevent Brandt from using it to refute the communication to Frome, or to prevent anyone else from examining it after his death. Which means they knew what the document contained, knew it would refute the accusation, and needed it removed, which means, Wolfe said, they were the author of the anonymous communication. They sent it, knowing it was false, knowing it would force Brandt to produce the very document that would expose their construction. They needed to take that document before it could be examined. He sat forward. Now, Archie, who in that building has sufficient technical knowledge to write a credible but false characterization of the company's compliance status? Leclerc, I said. She's the chief engineer. She knows the classification procedures inside and out. Who had the motive to destroy the Frome deal? Marsh, most obviously. Also Leclerc. Her employee ownership proposal would have been her preferred outcome. Who had the means and opportunity to access the building through the service entrance on the night of the murder, using a keycard that was not their own? I stopped. Marsh's keycard had been reported lost 3 weeks ago, replaced, but the old card, the reported lost card, would still have been functional in the system if no one had deactivated it, specifically. Only issued a replacement. Someone took Marsh's card, I said, and used it to get in that night. Which would mean the entry would log as Marsh's card, not the actual person's. Wolfe looked at me. Did the log show an entry on Marsh's new card that night? I checked my notes. No entry for Marsh's new card. But I ran my finger down the list. There's an entry on the facilities code at 952. The general access card managed by Mrs. Delgado. And Mrs. Delgado's whereabouts that evening? I'd asked her on my second visit. She'd been at her sister's house in the Bronx for a family dinner, with 12 people who could confirm it. She was accounted for, I said, which means someone else used that card. Or, Wolfe said, the card isn't what it appears to be. There are only a few people who would have had routine access to the facility's key card. The office manager, the operations director. He was quiet for a moment. Or the company's legal counsel who has had a comprehensive relationship with the company from its beginning, and whose access to its institutional materials would be, by Mrs. Brandt's own word, comprehensive. I looked at him. Webb, I said, he had prior knowledge of the Frome withdrawal letter. He has a relationship with the building that predates the current tenancy. His firm has handled all of the company's real estate matters. He would know the building systems. He has the legal and technical fluency to construct a credible, anonymous communication. Wolfe folded his hands. He also knew, because he drafted all versions of the restructuring agreement, what document Brandt kept in that drawer, the original signed agreement with the defense contractor that would establish unambiguously that the company's compliance procedures had been designed and approved by the same legal firm that is now trying to destroy the deal. Webb, I said, he torpedoed the deal, and the document that would prove it was his own work. That is the working theory, Wolfe said. It remains a theory. Tomorrow, we test it. How? He smiled, which he does rarely, and which never entirely reaches his eyes, being more the expression of a man who has solved a puzzle than of a man who is happy about it. by giving Mr. Webb the opportunity to confirm it without knowing he has done so. Getting Carter Webb back into the brownstone required a pretext, and Wolfe gave it to me. I was to call Webb's office and tell him that Nero Wolfe had recovered a document from the Brandt Precision Instruments building that he believed was relevant to the disposition of the estate, and that Webb's presence was requested at his earliest convenience to review it. This was, strictly speaking, not a lie. I had recovered a document, the copy of the Frome withdrawal letter that Mrs. Delgado had printed for me. Whether it was relevant to the estate was a matter of interpretation. Webb arrived at 3 p.m, alone, which he wouldn't have done if he'd had any idea what was waiting. He came in with his briefcase and his silver hair and his contained authority, and I showed him into the office where Wolfe was waiting with a folder on the desk between them. He sat. He looked at the folder. He looked at Wolfe. "You mentioned a document," he said. "I did," Wolfe said. "Thank you for coming promptly. Before we discuss it, I have 1 or 2 questions." Webb's eyes moved to the folder and back. "Of course. You have represented Brandt Precision Instruments since its founding, I believe. 31 years. And in that capacity, you have had access to the full range of the company's contractual and regulatory documentation. As its counsel, yes. Including the original agreement with the defense contractor, the classified timing component contract, which I understand required specific regulatory certification documentation that was executed by your firm." A pause, just long enough. "I'd have to review the specific documents you're referring to." "I think you know exactly which documents I'm referring to," Wolfe said, with a pleasantness that was more unnerving than directness. "You drafted the certification language. It is, by all accounts, impeccably executed, which is why when an anonymous communication was sent to Gerald Frome's compliance office suggesting a violation of export classification requirements, the communication had to quote selectively from that language, removing the contextual safeguards you yourself had built in." Webb was very still. "The communication to Frome's office," Wolfe continued, "was authored by someone with intimate knowledge of the certification documentation. That person knew precisely which clauses, read in isolation, could be made to appear problematic. That is not the knowledge of an engineer. An engineer would construct the argument from the technical specifications. This argument was constructed from the legal language, the indemnification clauses, the representation language, the certification framework. That is a lawyer's work." "That's a theory," Webb said. "It is. Let me offer a fact." Wolfe opened the folder. Inside it was not the Frome letter. It was a blank sheet of paper, but Webb didn't know that, because Wolfe kept his hand resting across it. "I spoke this morning with Professor Gerald Frome." That was true. I had arranged it. Frome was not a pleasant man, but he was a practical one, and Wolfe had offered him something valuable, the information that his withdrawal had been engineered, which gave him legal standing he would not otherwise have had. "Mr. Frome's compliance officer," Wolfe said, "retained the original anonymous communication. It was sent by postal mail, not electronically. However, the envelope was not discarded, and the postal mark on that envelope," he paused, "is consistent with a mail drop on the Upper East Side." Webb's expression didn't change, but his breathing did, very slightly. "I noted it from the bookcase." "Furthermore," Wolfe said, "the facility's key card for Brandt Precision Instruments, the general access card administered by Mrs. Delgado, was logged as having been used on the night of Mr. The text cuts off there. Brandt's murder. Mrs. Delgado was in the Bronx. The card was stored in the company's administrative office, to which you have had complete access for 31 years. And the security camera covering the service entrance was disabled approximately 2 weeks before the murder, a period coinciding with the week you received the Frome withdrawal letter, which you had transmitted." A long, still silence. Webb set his briefcase down very carefully on the floor beside his chair. "I'd like to call my attorney." "You may call your attorney at any time," Wolfe said. "I am not the police. I cannot compel you to remain. He leaned forward. "I will, however, tell you what I am going to tell Inspector Kramer this evening, and you may draw your own conclusions about how much time that gives you to act." Webb looked at him. "I am going to tell him," Wolfe said, "that the anonymous communication destroying the Frome deal was authored by the company's own legal counsel, that it was designed to force Richard Brandt to retrieve the original certification documentation, which would have refuted the communication and exposed its author, that its author then used a stolen facilities keycard to enter the building and murder Richard Brandt before he could act on what the document revealed, and that the motive was not hatred of Richard Brandt, but fear." Webb said very quietly, "Fear of what?" "Fear of what the Frome transaction would uncover." Wolfe's voice remained level. Gerald Frome's due diligence would have been exhaustive. It would have examined every aspect of the company's legal history, and in that examination, it would inevitably have surfaced the fact that the company's primary defense contract, the one whose certification your firm executed, had been renewed 3 years ago on terms that were materially different from the original agreement. Terms that were not disclosed to Richard Brandt in full. Webb's face was doing nothing at all, which is itself an expression. "You had renegotiated elements of that contract," Wolfe said, "in ways that were beneficial to the contractor, and that generated fees to your firm. Fees that were not disclosed, and that created a conflict of interest that would have ended your professional career and possibly your freedom." He sat back. "The Frome deal would have exposed this. You tried to kill the deal. When that failed, you killed Richard Brandt to prevent him from discovering, through that certification document, why the deal had really been withdrawn. Because Frome's team had been tipped off by someone who wanted them to look at the certification language very carefully." "You said," Webb said, "that someone tipped Frome." "Yes," Wolfe said, "and that is the piece I will admit to you that I do not yet have with certainty. Because the communication that went to Frome was not designed to protect the company or to help Richard Brandt. It was designed to frighten you, to let you know that someone knew what you'd done and was prepared to use it." He looked at Webb with something that was not precisely sympathy, but was not its opposite either. "Someone else knew about the contract renegotiation, and used that knowledge to set you in motion." Webb stood. He picked up his briefcase. He straightened his jacket with a gesture that had the quality of a man putting on armor that he knows has already been breached. "I need to make a phone call," he said. "Take your time," Wolfe said. "I'll be here." The following morning, Wolfe called them all back. It was 9 o'clock, which is before Wolfe normally speaks to anyone except Fritz, and the early hour was deliberate. People who are summoned at 9 in the morning to a meeting they don't understand have not yet fully assembled their defenses. Sylvia Brandt was there this time, at her request and Wolfe's acceptance. She sat in the corner chair, slightly removed from the arc of the others, with the same composed attention she'd brought to her first visit. She had earned the right to be present for this. Marsh, Leclerc, Norris, and Webb arranged themselves as they had before. Marsh on the left, Leclerc beside him, Norris in the middle, Webb on the right, but with a difference from the prior session. He sat with his briefcase in his lap, rather than on the floor. He looked like a man who has made a decision, and is waiting to see if it was the right one. Wolfe looked at them all for a long moment. Then he began. "I will be thorough," he said, "because each of you has carried a piece of this, and it is better to illuminate the whole than to leave anyone in the dark about the parts that concern them." He folded his hands. "Richard Brandt built this company over 30 years through a combination of technical excellence and personal integrity. He was, by all accounts, a man of his word and of rigorous method. What he was not, and this is not a criticism, was a lawyer. He trusted Carter Webb with the legal architecture of everything he built, and that trust was exploited. Webb was very still. 3 years ago," Wolfe said, "when the primary defense contract was renewed, Mr. Webb renegotiated several secondary provisions that in sum provided significant financial benefit to the contracting entity, and a corresponding referral fee arrangement to Mr. Webb's firm. This arrangement was not disclosed to Mr. Brandt, who signed the renewal documents, understanding them to be substantially similar to the original terms. They were not. Marsh said under his breath, "Son of a..." "Marsh," Wolfe said, "you will have your moment." He continued, "This undisclosed arrangement constituted a conflict of interest that would have ended Mr. Webb's professional life, and potentially resulted in criminal exposure. It also left the company with a defense contract that, examined carefully, contained provisions that a sufficiently sophisticated buyer, such as Gerald Frome, would have found troubling." Gerald Frome, Wolfe continued, was indeed planning to examine these provisions. His due diligence would have been exhaustive. Mr. Webb knew this because he drafted portions of the Frome transaction documents and recognized the scope of review they entailed. Norris exhaled through his nose. "So he tried to kill the deal." "He tried to kill the deal," Wolfe agreed. "He constructed an anonymous communication to Frome's compliance office, drawing on his deep knowledge of the certification documentation to select language that, in isolation, appeared to indicate an export classification concern. The communication was technically sophisticated. It used real language from real documents, but its conclusion was false. Mr. Frome's team, however, did not know that, and withdrew." He paused. This solved Mr. Webb's immediate problem. The deal died. Frome would not examine the contract. He looked at Webb. But it created a new problem, because the communication inciting the certification language had effectively pointed a careful reader toward the one document that could expose its own falsity: the original certification file, which contained the undisclosed arrangement in its appendices. Leclerc said quietly, "The document in Richard's drawer." "Just so." Richard Brandt received Frome's withdrawal letter and was told by Mr. Norris that the deal might be salvageable. Being a man who did not abandon things, he decided to address the regulatory question personally. He would retrieve the original certification file, verify the facts, and determine whether the concern raised by the anonymous communication was legitimate. "The phone call Monday night," Sylvia Brandt said. Wolfe looked at her. "Carter Webb called Richard Brandt Monday evening and told him something. I cannot know the exact substance, but the effect is clear. It sent Brandt to his office that night, specifically at a time of Webb's choosing. Perhaps Webb told him he had found new information about the regulatory concern. Perhaps he suggested they needed to review the documentation together. Whatever the pretext, Brandt went. He went and he looked at the file," I said, because Wolfe had nodded to me. "He found the appendices. He found the undisclosed arrangement. He wrote on his legal pad, not what he said." The room was very quiet. "Webb had obtained the General Facilities keycard," Wolfe continued. "He entered through the service entrance at 9:52, using a card that would log as the facilities code rather than his personal access. He went up through the internal stairwell, through the service corridor. Dr. Leclerc was already in that corridor. She had come to speak to Richard herself, and she heard the confrontation. Leclerc said nothing, but her jaw was set. Webb entered the office. Brandt had found what Webb feared he would find. There was a confrontation. Brandt said, according to the witness, 'That document was mine,' and Webb shot him. He took the certification file. He left the way he came. Carter Webb put his briefcase on the floor, very carefully, and then he said, 'There's one part you haven't explained.' 'There is,' Wolfe agreed, 'the part you asked me about yesterday. Who sent the communication that first alerted Frome, before your communication, which was intended to destroy the deal? Because you were not the first to move.' The room shifted. Everyone looked at Webb, and then, following some current of attention, at someone else. The first communication to Frome, Wolfe said, was not designed to destroy the deal. It was designed to trigger scrutiny, to cause Frome's team to look at the certification documents carefully enough to find the undisclosed arrangement. To expose Carter Webb. He looked at Paul Norris. 'Mr. Norris, you joined this company 3 years ago, shortly after the contract renewal. You are a financial officer. It was your job to review all material contracts. When did you discover the undisclosed arrangement? Norris was very still. I found a reference to it in the internal financial records, he said, after a pause, about 8 months ago. And you didn't tell Richard Brandt. He stopped. I wasn't certain what I was looking at. I needed more information. You needed a way to use it, Wolfe said, without particular judgment. The Frome deal was your initiative. You had brought Frome to the table. If the deal proceeded and the undisclosed arrangement were discovered through normal due diligence, you would be blamed for not having found it first. So you arranged for it to be found in a way that appeared independent. An anonymous tip to Frome's compliance team, just specific enough to direct their attention. I didn't want anyone to get hurt, Norris said. You wanted the deal to go through, the arrangement to be exposed, and Webb to be removed without your fingerprints on any of it. Wolfe's voice remained level. Instead, you set a man in motion who was desperate and ruthless, and Richard Brandt is dead. The word dead landed in the room with a flatness that no one argued with. Mr. Webb, Wolfe said, turning to him, anticipated that scrutiny. He moved faster than you expected. He killed the deal first, with his own communication, and then he killed the man who could have exposed him. He was quiet for a moment. You are not innocent of this, Mr. Norris. That is for others to determine the full weight of. Sylvia Brandt spoke. Is there enough for the police? There is enough for Inspector Kramer to obtain search warrants. The postal envelope from Frome's records, the keycard log, the blotter impressions, the undisclosed contract arrangement in the financial records that Mr. Norris can now be compelled to identify, and Dr. Leclerc's testimony regarding what she heard in that corridor. He looked at Webb. And I expect, when the full weight of the circumstances made clear to Mr. Webb and his new attorney, there will be additional cooperation forthcoming. Webb said nothing, but he didn't deny it either. And in that room, with those people, on that morning, silence of that particular quality is its own form of testimony. I called Inspector Kramer at 20 minutes past 10. He arrived with 2 men at 11:15 and left with Carter Webb at 11:40, which I thought showed commendable efficiency. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids by noon, having delivered his bill to Sylvia Brandt's attorney and his conclusions to the only audience he truly cares about, which is himself. I stayed in the office for a while after everyone had gone. Fritz brought me coffee without being asked, which is one of the genuine pleasures of working in a house where people pay attention. The orchids were doing whatever orchids do. The brownstone was quiet. Outside, New York was being New York, indifferent, operational, carrying on with the specific energy of a city that treats individual catastrophe as weather. A man had built something precise and careful over 30 years. He had trusted the wrong person with the architecture of it, and that trust had been the mechanism of his death. The killer had understood him completely. His habits, his sense of responsibility, his instinct to go to the source, to retrieve the original, to verify the facts personally. Richard Brandt had been killed by the same qualities that had made him good at what he did. That's the thing about precision. It can be used against you. Wolfe came back down at 6 for dinner. Fritz had produced a rack of lamb that deserved a monument, and we ate largely in silence, which is the best kind of meal after the kind of day that one. The watch, I said, over dessert. Wolfe looked at me. Leclerc was wearing a watch, I said, not a Brandt product. I noted it the first day. I thought it might mean something. And does it? No, I admitted. It just means she preferred a different brand. Wolfe considered this. Sometimes details are merely details. I know. I just like to close the loop. He looked at me with the expression of a man who finds this mildly endearing and would never admit it. Archie, he said, pour the wine. I poured the wine. Outside, the city went on ticking.